locked in a pitch-black metal shipping crate as the rising floodwaters seeped through the floorboards. Eva Callahan stared at the shredded remains of the only documents that could save her town. Her ribs throbbed where the mayor's guards had pinned her, and the meat hook she'd used to swing for her life lay uselessly out of reach. In her hand, she gripped a silver key, the gift from her best friend Sarah, only to watch the tiny red light on its head pulse with the steady rhythm of a tracking beacon. "She didn't just sell me out," Eva whispered into the rising damp, her voice cracking as the sound of the town hall vote began to echo over the festival speakers. She mapped the grave. Outside, the heavy machinery was already idling, ready to tear down the pit, and the only person who knew the truth was currently being buried alive by the people she had spent 20 years feeding. The knife slipped, biting into Eva's thumb. She hissed, sucking the copper tang from the wound before wiping it on her apron. No time to stop. The kitchen hummed like a swarm of angry hornets, grease spitting from the griddle, smoke curling around the exhaust fan that hadn't worked right since last winter. She flipped another burger, the meat sizzling, fat hissing against the hot metal. The order sheet. 20 trays of sliders, 15 pounds of fries, 3 sheet cakes. Taunted her from the counter. The ink smudged where she'd gripped it too hard. The air in the kitchen was a thick, humid soup of hickory smoke and desperation. Eva moved with a frantic, jagged rhythm, her boots scuffing against the grease-slicked linoleum. Every surface of Callahan's pit seemed to be vibrating with the strain of this massive town hall catering order. She reached for the heavy cast-iron lid of the Dutch oven, the heat searing through her thin oven mitts. Inside, the beans bubbled in a dark, molasses-thick lake, but she barely looked at them. Her eyes kept darting to the clock. The town hall expected this feast in less than 2 hours, and she was still wrestling with 40 pounds of pork shoulder that refused to pull. The weight of the world felt like it was concentrated in that narrow, smoke-filled room, pressing against her ribs until breathing became a conscious effort. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at the counter broke her concentration. Eva didn't turn, her spatula continuing its steady dance across the griddle. "If that's another delivery, it's late," she snapped, her voice gravelly from years of shouting over the fire. "Eva Callahan?" The voice was thin, nasal, and entirely too confident. Eva finally looked up, wiping a streak of ash across her forehead with the back of her wrist. A man stood there, wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly mortgage, and carrying a manila envelope like it was a holy relic. He looked out of place among the stained wood and the scent of burnt sugar. A predator in a cheap tie. "Busy," she grunted, turning back to the meat. "Ma'am, you need to acknowledge this notice of foreclosure. Your debts to the regional credit union have been consolidated and—" "I told the bank I'd have the payment by Friday," Eva interrupted, her jaw tightening until it ached. She slammed the spatula down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Out. I'm in the middle of a rush." The man didn't move. He slapped the envelope onto the stainless steel prep table, right next to a pile of raw brisket. "You can't ignore the math, Miss Callahan. This place is a relic. You're drowning in red ink, and the city isn't going to wait forever for its pound of flesh." Eva felt the heat of the stove rising into her face, but the fire in her chest was hotter. She stepped toward him, her hands still stained with the copper of her own blood and the salt of the meat. "I said out. Or you'll find out exactly how much a relic can hurt when it hits you." Her voice had dropped to that dangerous, quiet register that usually made men twice her size reconsider their life choices. The process server blanched, his confidence flickering like a dying bulb, and he beat a hasty retreat, though the envelope remained, a white scar on her silver counter. She couldn't look at it. Not yet. Instead, She retreated to the small, cluttered desk in the corner of the kitchen, where a stack of invoices sat under a paperweight made from a rusted horseshoe. She pulled the latest inventory logs toward her fingers trembling slightly. Something had been gnawing at her for weeks, a discrepancy she couldn't quite name. She began to run the numbers again, her pen scratching furiously against the ledger. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her primary suppliers, the people her father had done business with for 30 years, had hiked their prices for brisket, coal, and vinegar by exactly 40% in a single month. There had been no warning, no market shift to explain it. It was a surgical strike. They weren't just charging her more, they were bleeding her out. This wasn't just bad luck or a shifting economy. It was a coordinated effort to ensure that Callahan's pit couldn't survive the season. She stared at the numbers until they blurred into black smears, the stench of the kitchen suddenly feeling like the smell of a trap closing. The heavy thud of the back door swinging open made her jump. She reached instinctively for her boning knife before recognizing the limping gait of old Pete. The grizzled mechanic looked even more haggard than usual, his face smeared with engine oil and his pale eyes wide with an uncharacteristic urgency. "Ava," he wheezed, leaning against the doorframe. "You got a minute?" "Pete, I'm underwater here. The town hall order—" "Forget the sliders for a second," he interrupted, his voice a low rasp. "I was out by your north fence line, checking on that old pump. There's men out there. Men in orange vests with transits and stakes. They're marking the land, Eva. Marking it like they already own it." Eva felt a cold spike of adrenaline. "Surveyors? I didn't hire any surveyors. They ain't yours," Pete said, shaking his head. "They're driving stakes right into the heart of the south pasture. When I asked them what they were doing, one of them told me to mind my business, said the Forward Initiative had the permits. They're sizing you up for a coffin, girl." The violation felt intimate, like a hand sliding into her pocket. This was her land, the dirt her father had died for, the dirt that held the secret safe and the memories of 30 years of smoke. She walked to the window, looking out toward the shimmering heat of the Texas plains. The horizon was empty, but she could feel them out there, the invisible lines being drawn across her life. As she stood there, the air in the kitchen shifted. The familiar, comforting scent of slow-rendered fat and hickory smoke was suddenly pierced by something sharp and artificial. It was a chemical tang, like industrial solvent or bleach, rising from the very pots she was using to feed the town's elite. She rushed to the large stock pot of barbecue sauce, lifting the lid. The steam hit her, and she gagged. It wasn't the sweet, spicy aroma of her family's secret recipe. It was acrid, burning the back of her throat. "Pete, smell this," she whispered, her voice trembling. The old man leaned over, sniffing cautiously. He recoiled, coughing into his hand. "That ain't vinegar, Eva. That smells like the stuff we use to degrease engine blocks." The horror of it settled in her gut. Someone had been in her kitchen. Someone had tainted the food. It wasn't just about the money anymore. They were willing to poison the town to get to her. The corruption wasn't just in the town hall or the bank. It was in the very air she breathed, a rot that had finally reached the heart of her sanctuary. The front bell chimed, not the friendly jingle of a customer, but a sharp, insistent sound. Two men stepped into the kitchen, bypassing the employees-only sign with a practiced arrogance. They wore matching charcoal suits that looked like armor, and their faces were masks of bureaucratic indifference. One of them carried a metal sign and a cordless drill. "Can I help you?" Eva asked, her hand sliding across the counter to grip the handle of her 12-inch cast-iron skillet. "Survey access area." the taller one said, gesturing to the sign. It was bright yellow with bold black lettering. Per the municipal code regarding the Franklin Forward Initiative, this facility is now designated as a primary transit point for site assessment. We're installing the notification now. You aren't installing a damn thing, Eva said, her voice rising. Get out of my kitchen before I make you. The second man, shorter and thicker through the neck, stepped forward, his eyes small and mean. Don't make this difficult, Ms. Callahan. We have the mayor's signature. This is public interest now. You're just a tenant of history, and your lease is up. He raised the drill, the whir of the motor a high-pitched whine that set Eva's teeth on edge. He moved toward the wall, reaching for the space right next to her father's framed pitmaster certification. That was the final straw. Eva didn't think. She moved. Her body remembered the mechanics of violence from a dozen old barroom scraps she shouldn't have won. She swung the cast-iron skillet in a brutal, horizontal arc. It connected with the drill, sending the tool flying across the room in a spray of plastic shards. The man gasped, clutching his numbed hand. But Eva wasn't finished. She grabbed a ladle from the nearby fryer station, dipping it into a shallow pan of hot bacon grease she'd set aside. I said, she growled, flicking the ladle. Get out. The spray of hot fat caught the taller man across his expensive lapels. He shrieked, stumbling back as the grease sizzled against the fabric. It wasn't enough to cause a third-degree burn, but it was enough to terrify a man who had never seen a day of real work. She stepped into their space, the heavy skillet raised like a mace, her eyes burning with a primal, territorial rage. This is my house. You want to survey something? Survey the nearest hospital because that's where you're headed if you don't move. They scrambled backward, their polished shoes slipping on the floor. In the frantic rush to the door, the taller man's briefcase clipped the edge of the prep table, popping open. Papers fluttered like wounded birds. He tried to grab them, but Eva lunged forward, her boot slamming down on a thick, high-quality leather folder that had slid across the tile. Go, she roared. They fled, the door banging against the wall so hard the glass rattled. Eva stood in the center of the kitchen, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, the skillet still heavy in her hand. The adrenaline was a roar in her ears, a deafening tide that slowly receded, leaving her trembling. She looked down at the leather folder beneath her boot. It felt like a trophy, a piece of the enemy's skin. You all right, girl? Pete asked from the doorway, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and admiration. I'm fine, she lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached down and snatched up the folder. It was cool to the touch, the leather smelling of expensive cedar and secrets. She retreated to the back office, the only room with a lock that still worked. She sat at the desk and flipped the folder open. Her breath hitched. Inside was a large, multi-layered map of Franklin. But it wasn't the town she knew. It was a digital rendering of a future that looked like a graveyard. The Franklin Forward Initiative was laid out in chilling detail. The historic district leveled, the town square replaced by concrete slabs, and a massive, sprawling complex sitting right where Callahan's pit currently stood. But it was the margins that broke her heart. The map was covered in handwritten notes, zoning codes, buyout thresholds, and strategic points of leverage against specific shop owners. Eva knew that handwriting. She had seen it on 1,000 grocery lists, on birthday cards, on the back of old photographs. It was elegant, precise, and unmistakable. It belonged to Sarah Reyes. Sarah, her best friend since they were 6. Sarah, who had held her hand at Big Tom's funeral. Sarah, who now worked as Mayor Hollister's right hand. Eva stared at the notes. Callahan property. Target via supply chain disruption. Foreclosure timeline, 30 days. Emotional volatility, high. Use as anchor for South Sector demolition. The betrayal was a physical weight, a stone in her chest that made it hard to swallow. Sarah wasn't just a bystander or a civil servant doing her job. She was the architect. She was the one who knew exactly where to twist the knife because she was the one who knew exactly where Eva was soft. The map blurred as Eva's eyes filled with hot, stinging tears of rage. Her closest ally had become her most dangerous enemy, and she had been invited to the slaughter by the person she trusted most in the world. The morning sun of the following day felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. Eva stood in front of her primary smoker, a massive, offset beast of black steel she called the General. It had been her father's pride, seasoned by decades of smoke and sweat. Now, as she opened the heavy lid, the scent that wafted out wasn't the rich, oaky perfume of perfectly rendered beef. It was the sharp, stinging odor of industrial degreaser. She pulled back the foil on a 20-pound brisket. The meat was gray, the fat slick with a translucent, oily film that didn't belong. She touched it with a gloved finger and pulled back. The chemical smell was so strong it made her eyes water. They had done it. They had bypassed the locks or come in through the vents and poured poison directly onto her livelihood. Hundreds of pounds of meat, thousands of dollars in product, were now nothing more than toxic waste. "They're trying to kill us, Pete," she whispered as the old mechanic walked up behind her. "Not just the business," Pete said, looking at the ruined meat. "If you'd served this at the festival tonight, you'd have half the town in the ICU. The health department would shut you down before the sun went down tomorrow. It's a clean kill, Eva. No mess, no fuss, just a public health scandal to wipe the Callahans off the map." Eva felt a cold, hard resolve settle over her. The grief for the lost meat, for the money she didn't have, was eclipsed by a terrifying clarity. They weren't playing by the rules of business or law. This was a war of extinction. "I have 6 hours," she said, checking her watch. "The fall festival starts at 6. The mayor is holding that emergency zoning vote right in the middle of the opening ceremony. He thinks he's already won. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to the others," Eva said, grabbing her denim jacket. "They can't intimidate everyone." But as she walked down Main Street, the town felt like a ghost of itself. She stopped at Sweetwater's Bakery, the bell chiming as she entered. Mrs. Gable, who had known Eva since she was in diapers, didn't look up from the counter. Her hands were shaking as she boxed up a dozen donuts. "Mrs. Gable, we need to talk about the vote tonight," Eva started. The older woman finally looked at her, and the fear in her eyes was a physical barrier. "I can't, Eva. I had an inspector in here this morning. Said my ventilation wasn't up to code. Said if I didn't keep my head down, he'd have to pull my license by noon. I've got a pension to think about." Eva moved to the hardware store, then the cafe. It was the same story everywhere. Men in dark suits, inspectors with clipboards and cold eyes, were patrolling the sidewalks like an occupying army. Doors were slammed in her face. Eyes were averted. The community she had grown up in had been hollowed out by fear in less than 24 hours. She was standing in the middle of the street, a pariah in her own home. Realizing that the Franklin Forward Initiative had already won the hearts and minds of the town through sheer, unadulterated terror, she retreated toward the pit, her mind racing. She needed a way to get that folder to someone who mattered. But who was left? As she reached the back entrance of the restaurant, she reached for the handle and froze. The heavy steel door, which she always left unlocked during the day for deliveries, was immobile. She pulled harder. Nothing. She looked at the hinges. A brand new industrial deadbolt had been installed from the outside, the metal gleaming and mocking. She was locked out of her own building. Panic, sharp and hot, flared in her chest. She turned to run toward the front, but the narrow service alley felt suddenly smaller. She headed for her delivery truck, the old Ford that had seen her through 100 catering jobs. As she approached, she saw the slant of the chassis. Her heart sank. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber gaping open in long, surgical smiles. They were stripping her of every option, every tool, every exit. Looking for a ride? The voice came from the shadows of the bakery's loading dock. A man stepped out, wearing a dark windbreaker and a black face mask that obscured everything but his cold, flat eyes. He was holding a high-voltage taser, the prongs crackling with a rhythmic blue spark that sounded like a hornet. "The folder, Eva," he said, his voice modulated and toneless. "Give it to me, and you can walk away from this town with your skin intact. Otherwise, things are going to get very painful, very quickly." Eva backed away, her mind spinning. The alley was a dead end. To her left was the brick wall of the bakery. To her right, the corrugated metal of her own warehouse. She had spent 20 years in these shadows. She knew every crack in the pavement, every loose board, every hidden corner. "You want it?" she asked, reaching into her jacket. "Come and get it." She bolted, not toward the street, but deeper into the labyrinth of the service corridors. The inspector followed, his heavy boots thudding against the asphalt. Eva ducked behind a stack of empty crates, her breath coming in silent, controlled bursts. She wasn't just running. She was leading him. She rounded the corner near the loading dock, where a massive wooden storage rack held the overflow of flour and sugar for the bakery. She had repaired the manual release lever for Mrs. Gable 6 months ago. It was old, rusted, and prone to catastrophic failure if pulled the wrong way. The man rounded the corner, the taser crackling. "There's nowhere to go, Eva. Don't be a hero. This town isn't worth dying for." He stepped onto the designated loading zone, his eyes fixed on her. Eva reached out, her fingers curling around the cold iron of the release lever. She didn't hesitate. She threw her entire weight into the pull. The groan of protesting metal filled the alley. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the safety pins sheared off. A massive 3,000-pound pallet of flour, stacked 6 feet high, slid from the rack. The man didn't even have time to scream. The pallet hit the ground with a bone-shaking thud, pinning his legs and lower torso beneath a mountain of white dust and splintered wood. The taser clattered to the ground, sparking harmlessly in a puddle of rainwater. Eva stood over him, her chest heaving, her face smeared with white powder. He was alive, groaning and clutching at the wood, but he wasn't going anywhere. She didn't wait to see if he had friends. She snatched up the taser, tucked the folder tighter under her arm, and vanished into the shadows of the historic district. She found a secure spot in the crawlspace beneath the old mission church, the scent of damp earth and ancient cedar surrounding her. She pulled out the folder and a small flashlight. She needed to know why. Why would Hollister risk everything for a small-town buyout? She began to dig deeper into the memos, cross-referencing the zoning maps with the environmental impact reports she'd snatched. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. The Franklin Forward Initiative wasn't a mall. It wasn't a retail hub. It was a licensed facility for the processing and storage of Class 4 toxic industrial waste. The retail conglomerate was a shell company, a hollow vessel designed to absorb liability before the town's water table was permanently poisoned. And at the bottom of the final page, in the signature line for the primary stakeholder of the shell company, was a name that made the world go cold. Richard Hollister. The mayor wasn't just selling the town. He was the buyer. He was using public funds to build a private tomb for the county's filth. And he was going to walk away with millions while the people of Franklin died of cancers they couldn't name. She had the proof. She had the motive. Now, all she had to do was survive long enough to show it to the world. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the town of Franklin transformed. The fall festival lights, strings of colorful bulbs draped across Main Street, flickered to life, but they felt garish and wrong. The air was thick with a tension that even the smell of funnel cakes couldn't mask. Ava watched from the shadows of an alleyway as Sheriff Miller and a half-dozen deputies moved with military precision. They weren't patrolling for drunk teenagers. They were cordoning off Callahan's pit with bright yellow biohazard tape. "I'm sorry, Eva," Miller said, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Preliminary reports show a massive chemical leak in your refrigeration system. For the safety of the public, this site is condemned until further notice." It was a lie, a beautiful legal lie that stripped her of her ground. She watched as they locked her gates, effectively erasing her from the map. Then, as if on cue, the streetlights hummed and died. The entire town square was plunged into a thick, unnatural darkness, a coordinated blackout. The conspirators were clearing the stage for the final act. "Ava." The whisper came from behind a stack of hay bales. Ava spun, the taser gripped in her hand. Sarah stood there, her blonde hair disheveled, her expensive blazer stained with soot. She looked terrified. "Don't come any closer," Eva hissed. "I know what you think," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver key. "But I can't let him do this. Not the waste hub. I thought it was just development, Eva. I thought we were saving the economy. I didn't know about the poison." "You wrote the notes, Sarah. You targeted me." "He made me," Sarah cried, tears tracking through the dust on her face. "But I can help you. This key, it's for the town hall's master PA system. The control room is in the back of the stage. If you can get there, you can tell them. You can show them the maps." Ava looked at the key, then at her old friend's face. Every instinct she had screamed that this was a trap, but it was the only play she had left. She snatched the key, her fingers brushing Sarah's cold skin. "If you're lying to me, Sarah, I'll make sure you're the first one to drink the water from that hub." She moved through the darkened alleys, a shadow among shadows. The festival goers were huddled in groups, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of cell phone screens. The deputies were everywhere, their flashlight beams cutting through the dark like searchlights. Ava moved with the stealth of a predator, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached the rear of the festival grandstand, a massive wooden structure built for the night's speeches. She could hear Hollister's voice through the muffled air, the sound of a man who believed he was untouchable. "We stand at a crossroads," the mayor's voice boomed, unamplified but carrying in the stillness. "A choice between the decay of the past and the prosperity of the future." Eva began to climb the scaffolding, her fingers gripping the rough-hewn timber. She was 20 feet up when a light hit her. There she is, 2 of Hollister's private security guards. Men in tactical gear, not deputies, spotted her from the ground. They began to scramble up the supports with frightening speed. Eva didn't look down. She lunged for a service ladder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was cornered beneath the main stage floor, the massive wooden beams pressing in on her. The 3 guards blocked the only exits, their faces illuminated by the tactical lights on their belts. One of them reached for a pair of heavy-duty zip ties. "End of the line, Callahan. Give us the folder." Ava's eyes darted around the cramped, dusty space. Hanging from a nearby equipment rack was a heavy, rusted meat hook used for moving stage weights. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the iron handle, hooked it over a support cable, and kicked off the beam with every ounce of strength in her legs. She swung in a brutal, gravity-fed arc. The heavy hook caught the lead guard in the chest, the impact sending him flying backward into his companions. They collapsed in a heap of tangled limbs and equipment. Ava didn't waste a second. She used the momentum of the swing to propel herself toward the upper ladder, her hands stinging from the friction of the cable. She reached the top and scrambled onto the stage, but the heavy black curtain parted, and Richard Hollister stepped out. He wasn't the polished politician anymore. His silver hair was perfectly in place, but his eyes were voids of cold, calculating malice. He held a small black device in his hand, and his smile was a jagged line of teeth. "You're a persistent little pest, aren't you, Ava?" "It's over, Hollister. I have the maps. I have the deeds." Hollister laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He held up a stack of papers. "You mean these? I've spent the last 6 hours buying up every debt your father ever incurred, every loan you took to keep that grease trap running. I don't just own the land, Ava. I own you. I own your labor, your future, and every breath you take in this town." He stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne and old rot surrounding him. "And as for your little friend Sarah, did you really think she'd choose you? That key she gave you? It's not for the PA system. It's a GPS beacon. My men didn't find you by accident. She led you right to the slaughter, just like she always does." Ava felt the world tilt. The betrayal was final, a cold blade through the heart. She looked down at the silver key in her hand, and sure enough, a tiny, rhythmic red light pulsed from the base of the metal. "Take her," Hollister said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The guards seized her, their hands like iron. They snatched the leather folder from her grip and handed it to Hollister. He didn't even look at it. He fed the documents into a portable industrial shredder sitting on the edge of the stage. Ava watched in a trance of despair as the maps, the deeds, and the proof of the toxic hub were turned into a mountain of white confetti in seconds. "Lock her in the crate," Hollister ordered, "and start the vote. I want this finished before the moon is high." They dragged her to a heavy steel storage crate beneath the stage. It was cold, smelling of damp earth and rust. They threw her inside, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. The padlock clicked. Eva was alone in the total, suffocating darkness. Above her, she could hear the rhythmic thud of the town council members taking their seats. The vote was starting. She was bankrupt, silenced, and betrayed by everyone she had ever loved. The darkness felt like it was filling her lungs, a weight she couldn't lift, a silence she couldn't break. The first drop of rain hit the metal roof of the crate with the sound of a spent shell casing. Within minutes, the Texas sky had opened up, a torrential downpour that turned the ground beneath the stage into a churning river of mud. Eva sat in the corner of the crate, her knees pulled to her chest. The water began to seep in through the gaps in the floor, cold and relentless. It rose around her ankles, then her waist. The freezing tide was a physical manifestation of her failure. She was going to drown in a box, while the man who killed her father sold the town's soul. "Think, Eva," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "Think like a butcher." She reached into the hidden pocket of her work boot. Her fingers closed around the slim, sharpened shaft of a professional meat thermometer she'd tucked away during the chaos in the kitchen. It wasn't a lockpick, but it was high-grade stainless steel, and she knew exactly how a tumbler felt when it was under pressure. The water reached her chest, the chill leaching the strength from her limbs. She fumbled for the lock on the inside of the door, her fingers numb and clumsy. She could hear the muffled voice of the council secretary above her. All in favor of the Franklin Forward Initiative. Signify by saying aye. Not today, Eva hissed. She jammed the thermometer into the keyhole, using a piece of her leather belt for leverage. She felt the pins resist, then groan. She twisted with every ounce of desperate, primal strength she had left. Click, the mechanism triggered. She threw her shoulder against the heavy steel door. It swung open into the muddy darkness, sending a wave of water cascading out. She scrambled out, her clothes soaked and heavy, her face a mask of soot and rage. She didn't run for the street. She looked up at the skeletal underside of the stage. The ventilation shafts for the town hall's old climate control system ran right above her. They were narrow, rusted, and filled with decades of dust. But they led to the one place Hollister couldn't reach. She pulled herself into the metal tunnel, the edges of the tin cutting into her palms. She crawled through the dark, the sound of her own breath echoing like a bellows. She followed the hum of the electrical lines, her mind focused on a single point of light. She reached the central hub of the PA system, a small, cramped room filled with flickering monitors and tangled wires. She didn't need the shredded papers. She reached into her apron and pulled out her cell phone. During their confrontation on the stage, she hadn't just been listening to Hollister's taunts. She had hit record. She bypassed the security locks with a frantic, intuitive grace, patching her phone directly into the master output. She didn't hesitate. She hit play and cranked the gain until the speakers hummed with feedback. I don't just own the land, Eva. I own you. I own your labor, your future. The toxic hub is just the beginning. The artifacts from the old mission, already sold to the black market in Austin. Hollister's voice, cold, arrogant, and utterly damning, exploded across the town square. It wasn't the voice of a leader. It was the voice of a predator bragging about his kill. The entire festival fell into a deathly, vacuum-like silence. The eyes died in the council members' throats. Thousands of people stood frozen, listening to their mayor admit to poisoning their water and stealing their history. Eva kicked open the ventilation hatch behind the podium. She emerged like a ghost from the machine, covered in mud, her hair a wild tangle, her eyes burning with a righteous, terrifying light. Hollister stood at the podium, his face the color of ash. He turned, his mouth working but no sound coming out. The recording continued to play, a loop of his own hubris echoing off the brick buildings of Main Street. You missed a spot, Richard, Eva said, her voice carrying across the silent square. The crowd didn't wait for a signal. The residents of Franklin, the shop owners who had been intimidated, the mothers who were scared for their children, the men who had worked the land for generations, moved as one. They surged toward the stage, a wave of human fury that overwhelmed the private security guards in seconds. The barriers were trampled. The guards retreated, realizing that no paycheck was worth facing a town that had finally found its voice. Eva stood tall at the edge of the stage, looking down at the people she had known her whole life. We let this happen, she shouted, her voice raw. We stayed quiet while he took our pride. We stayed quiet while he sold our dirt. Look at him. Look at the man you were going to give your future to. The verbal autopsy was brutal. She laid bare the cowardice of the council, the corruption of the sheriff, and the rot that had nearly swallowed them all. Hollister tried to flee, scrambling toward the back of the stage, but the crowd was already there. The very people he had promised jobs to, the people he had called tenants of history, tackled him to the ground. They held him there, not with violence, but with the immovable weight of justice, until the blue and red lights of the state police began to crest the hill. As the authorities led Hollister away in the back of a cruiser, Ava looked for the one person she needed to see. But Sarah's office was dark. The silver-blonde architect of the betrayal was gone, leaving behind nothing but an empty desk and a suitcase of cash that the deputies would find an hour later. Sarah had chosen her side, and it wasn't the side of the survivors. Eva walked back to Callahan's pit. The yellow tape was still there, but she tore it down with a single, steady pull. She walked into her kitchen, the air still smelling of the chemical sabotage, but the fire was still there. She reached for a match. She struck it against the brick of the smoker. The flame was small, but it was bright. "One meal at a time," she whispered to the empty room. She lit the hickory. The smoke began to rise, thin and white at first, then thick and blue, drifting out into the Texas night. The town was broken, and the community was fractured, but the land was still hers. And as long as the fire was burning, there was still a chance to make things right.